The black SUV moved through the city like a predatory shadow, the tinted windows swallowing the neon lights of Chicago, until only the cold, artificial glow of the dashboard remained. Arya sat in the back, her fingers still stained with the drying copper of the man she'd seen die. Beside her, the man who had spared her life, Dante Salvatore, didn't look at her. He simply stared forward, his profile as sharp and unforgiving as the blade of a knife. The silence in the car was heavy, a suffocating pressure that made her lungs feel tight, as if she were still gasping for air in that warehouse. When the vehicle finally slowed, it wasn't at a police station or a hospital, but at the gates of a sprawling limestone estate that looked more like a fortress than a home. The iron bars hummed open, and Arya felt the final thread of her old life snap. As the doors opened, the humid night air was replaced by the chilled, scentless atmosphere of the foyer. Dante stepped out first, his presence commanding the immediate attention of the armed men flanking the entrance. He turned to her, his eyes like polished flint. "This is your world now, Arya Mitchell," he said, his voice a low, melodic threat. "In this house, the girl who delivered packages no longer exists." A tall, severe woman in a high-collared dress stepped forward, gesturing for Arya to follow. She was led up a sweeping marble staircase and into a room that was a masterpiece of cold luxury. On the bed lay a crisp, black-and-white uniform, its fabric stiff and unforgiving. Beside it sat a small silver bowl. "Your phone," the woman commanded, extending a hand. Arya hesitated, her hand hovering over her pocket where her cracked device buzzed with a notification, likely her boss wondering why the delivery wasn't confirmed. With trembling fingers, she placed the phone in the bowl. It was her only link to the outside, to her mother's texts and her unpaid bills. The woman took it without a word and left, the heavy oak door clicking shut with a finality that echoed in Arya's chest. She stood alone in the center of the opulent room, the silence pressing in on her. She looked at the uniform, then at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The girl in the red polo shirt was wide-eyed and blood-splattered, a ghost of a life she could no longer reach. She reached for the zipper of her shirt, her hands shaking, realizing that Dante hadn't just saved her. He had erased. The morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the estate, but it brought no warmth to the cold, sterile room. Arya smoothed the front of her black uniform, the fabric feeling like a second skin she hadn't asked for. She was no longer Arya Mitchell, the girl with a delivery route and a mountain of student loans. She was a shadow in the halls of the Salvatore Syndicate. As she moved toward the kitchen to begin her duties, a hand clamped onto her shoulder like a vice. She was spun around to face a man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw. This was Enzo, Dante's second-in-command, a man whose reputation for brutality was whispered even in the deepest corners of the city. He didn't speak at first. He simply leaned in, his breath smelling of bitter espresso and tobacco, his eyes raking over her with a predatory suspicion. "The Don might think you're a pretty bird to keep in a cage, but to me, you're just a leak waiting to happen," Enzo hissed, his voice like grinding gravel. He pulled a small, silver-plated knife from his belt and traced the air inches from her throat. "In this house, we don't have maids. We have people who know how to bury what they see. If you trip, if you talk, or if you even look at the gates too long, I won't wait for his permission to silence you." Arya's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. She had spent years navigating the dangerous streets of Chicago. She knew that showing fear was an invitation to be crushed. "I'm just here to do my job," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her resolve. Enzo's sneer deepened as he stepped back, but the threat remained in the air. As he walked away, Arya looked toward the other staff members, the cook chopping meat with a rhythmic, violent intensity, and the laundress who watched her with eyes that were void of any empathy. She realized then that the danger didn't just come from the men with guns standing at the perimeter. The entire household was an extension of Dante's will. Every person under this roof was a predator in their own right, and she was the only prey. She moved to the sink, her hands shaking as she began to scrub the fine china. She was surrounded by enemies, but as she looked at the heavy oak doors leading to Dante's private study, she realized the greatest threat wasn't the enforcer's knife. It was the man who had decided she was too beautiful to kill. Her. The clock in the grand hallway struck midnight, the deep chime echoing like a funeral knell through the silent estate. Arya carried the silver tray with a steady hand, though her heart felt like a trapped bird against her ribs. On it sat a bottle of vintage scotch, a clean glass, and a first aid kit she had scavenged from the servants' pantry. She had seen the way Dante had stepped out of the car an hour earlier, his gait stiff, a dark stain blossoming across the shoulder of his charcoal suit that wasn't there when he'd left. She knocked softly on the heavy oak doors of his study. When no answer came, she pushed them open, the scent of expensive tobacco and old leather washing over her. Dante was slumped in his high-backed chair, his jacket discarded on the floor. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned, pulled back to reveal a jagged graze along his ribs. He looked less like a god of death in the dim lamplight and more like a man made of breaking parts. "I didn't ask for a medic," he rasped, his eyes remaining closed. "You didn't ask for a delivery girl either," Arya replied quietly, setting the tray on the low table beside him. "But here we are." Dante opened his eyes, the flinty grey softening into something weary as he watched her soak a cotton pad in antiseptic. He didn't pull away when she leaned in. Up close, she could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes and the way his jaw tightened as the chemicals stung his skin. For the first time, the power dynamic shifted. He was the one vulnerable, and she was the one with the steady hand. "You have a light touch," he remarked, his voice losing its serrated edge. "Most people in my life only know how to leave bruises." "Maybe that's because you only surround yourself with monsters," Arya murmured, focusing on the bandage. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. The first real expression she had seen that wasn't a mask of cold authority. "In my world, monsters are the only ones who stay loyal." "What does that make you, Arya?" "A witness," she said, looking up to meet his gaze. "A girl who's trying to figure out if the man who saved her is just a different kind of monster." Dante reached out, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her wrist, which was fluttering wildly. He didn't squeeze, he simply held her there, a silent acknowledgement of the strange, fragile bridge forming between them. For a long moment, the blood-stained warehouse and the threats of the enforcer felt a lifetime away. There was only the low hum of the city outside and the quiet realization that, for the first time in 3 years, Arya wasn't just surviving, she was being seen. The heavy silence of the estate usually felt like a shield, but tonight it felt like a trap. Arya moved through the darkened corridors with the practiced stealth of a ghost, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished wood. She had been tasked with cleaning the library, but her eyes kept drifting toward the hidden alcove behind the mahogany desk, where she had seen Dante disappear earlier. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed the danger of what she was about to do. The safe was hidden behind a row of leather-bound classics, its digital face glowing with a faint, mocking blue light. She shouldn't have known the code, she was just the maid. But she had seen Dante's fingers dance across the keypad a dozen times while she polished the nearby silver. With a hand that trembled despite her resolve, she punched in the numbers. The soft click of the mechanism felt as loud as a gunshot in the stillness of the room. Inside, tucked beneath stacks of cold, hard cash and travel documents, sat the black box. It was the same one from the warehouse, the cardboard still stiff, where the blood had dried into a dark, ugly stain. She pulled it out, the weight of it familiar and terrifying. When she pried the lid open, she didn't find drugs or money. Instead, there was a stack of grainy photographs and a series of encrypted ledgers. As she flipped through the pages, the breath left her lungs. There were dates, meeting locations, and wire transfer amounts, all linked to Enzo, Dante's most trusted enforcer. The photographs showed Enzo in deep conversation with men wearing the insignia of the rival Moretti family. This wasn't just a delivery, it was a dossier. The man Dante had killed in the warehouse hadn't been the traitor. He had been the messenger trying to warn Dante about the real mole. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, and Arya froze, clutching the evidence to her chest. The black box was a death sentence for anyone holding it. She realized then that Dante wasn't just a predator sitting at the top of the food chain. He was a man being hunted from within his own inner circle. Her empathy, the flaw she couldn't seem to shake, flared painfully. If she put the box back, she could stay safe and invisible, but if she did, the man who had looked at her and seen a person instead of a loose end would be dead by morning. The transition from the shadows of the estate to the blinding light of the Metropolitan Gala felt like a fever dream. Arya stood before the full-length mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The stiff maid's uniform had been replaced by a gown of midnight silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, the deep neckline a daring contrast to the obsidian necklace gracing her throat. Dante stood behind her, his reflection a stark, powerful silhouette in a tuxedo that made him look like royalty rather than a rogue. He reached forward, his fingers cool as they adjusted a stray curl at her temple. "Tonight, you aren't the girl from the warehouse," he whispered, his gaze meeting hers in the glass. "You are the only woman I trust in a room full of liars." The gala was a sea of glittering diamonds and whispered conspiracies. As they entered the ballroom, the heavy weight of silence followed them, exactly as it had at the restaurant months ago. Arya kept her chin high, her hand resting on Dante's arm, feeling the coiled tension in his muscles. She could feel Enzo's eyes on them from across the room, sharp, suspicious, and simmering with a hidden agenda. The maid title was a discarded mask. Here, she was the bait designed to make the traitor move. Dante leaned in close as they moved toward the center of the dance floor, his breath warm against her ear. "The Moretti family is watching," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the swelling orchestra. "They expect me to be distracted by you. Let them think I am." He pulled her into the dance, his hand firm on the small of her back. For a moment, the danger faded into the rhythm of the waltz. The way he looked at her wasn't just part of the act. It was the same intense, searching stare he'd given her when he told her she was too pretty to bury. But as the music reached a crescendo, Arya spotted a flicker of movement in the shadows of the balcony, a flash of silver that looked remarkably like Enzo's signature knife. The black box's secrets were no longer just ink on paper. They were a looming threat in the middle of a crowded room. She tightened her grip on Dante's shoulder, her heart thundering against her ribs. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was the only shield, standing between the man who had claimed her and the man who wanted to end him. The chaos of the gala provided a frantic, glittering backdrop for the choice Arya never expected to make. In the confusion of a sudden power surge that flickered the chandeliers, she found herself separated from Dante's side by a surge of panicked socialites. She backed away toward a service corridor, her heart hammering against the silk of her gown, and found it, an unlocked side exit. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing a narrow alley that smelled of rain and freedom. Beyond that door lay the city she knew, the subway lines, and a life where no one looked at her with a predator's hunger. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling with the ghost of her former life. She could run. She could disappear into the Chicago fog and never look back at the Salvatore estate or the man who had turned her into a gilded prisoner. But as she pulled the door toward her, she caught a glimpse of a reflection in the polished brass of the handle. On the balcony above the ballroom, Enzo was moving with a lethal, singular focus. He wasn't looking at the exits. He was looking down at Dante, who stood alone near the center of the floor, his back turned as he scanned the crowd for Aria. In Enzo's hand, the signature blade glinted, ready to be driven home under the cover of the next planned blackout. The cold air from the alley hit Aria's face, a promise of safety, but she couldn't move. She thought of the midnight tray, the way Dante's thumb had grazed her wrist, and the silent vulnerability of the man who had been hunted from within. He had looked at her and seen a person worth saving when the rest of the world saw a loose end. If she left now, she would be free, but he would be dead before she reached the end of the block. Aria let go of the door. The sound of it clicking shut behind her was the final death of the delivery girl she used to be. She turned back toward the darkness of the gala, her silk heels clicking sharply against the marble. She wasn't running toward freedom anymore. She was running toward the monster, driven by a fierce, terrifying loyalty she no longer cared to fight. She had to reach him before the lights went out for good. The darkness that followed the gala wasn't a reprieve, it was a prelude to slaughter. By the time the black SUV tore back through the estate gates, the limestone walls were already illuminated by the rhythmic flash of gunfire. The Moretti family hadn't waited for the mole to finish the job. They had come to tear the Salvatore empire down by the roots. Dante moved with a lethal, practiced fluidity, his hand clamped around Aria's wrist as he dragged her through the chaos of shattered glass and silk hangings. "Into the study! Move!" Dante's voice was a roar over the concussive blasts of submachine guns. They barely cleared the threshold before a grenade detonated in the foyer, the shock wave throwing them both against the far wall. Dust and the smell of cordite choked the air. Dante scrambled to the hidden keypad, his fingers slick with a new coat of crimson that wasn't his own. The bookshelf groaned and slid aside, revealing a cramped, steel-lined safe room. He shoved Aria inside and collapsed against the door as it hissed shut, sealing out the screams and the thunder of the assault. The silence of the safe room was deafening, broken only by their ragged, synchronized gasps. The space was barely 4 feet deep, forced intimacy in a box of cold metal. Aria's midnight silk gown was torn at the shoulder, her skin smudged with soot, but her eyes were fixed on the jagged wound in Dante's thigh. "You stayed!" Dante wheezed, his head thumping back against the steel wall. He looked at her, his grey eyes searching hers with a raw intensity that the shadows couldn't hide. "I saw you at the exit. You had the door open. Why did you come back to a dying man?" Aria reached out, her fingers trembling as she pressed them against his jaw, forcing him to look at her. The delivery girl was gone, replaced by someone forged in the fire of the last hour. "Because you looked at me," she whispered, her voice cracking but steady. "For 3 years I was a ghost in this city. People looked through me, over me, around me, but you..." You saw everything I was trying to hide. I couldn't let them kill the only person who actually knows I exist. Dante's hand came up, covering hers, his thumb tracing the same pulse point he'd found in the study. The predatory mask finally shattered, leaving only the man who had lost his mother at 15 and built a cage to keep the world away. I didn't save you because you were pretty, Arya, he confessed, his voice dropping to a vulnerable vibration. I saved you because you looked at me with the same defiance I felt every day of my life. I didn't want a maid. I wanted to see if someone like you could survive a man like me. In the suffocating heat of the safe room, with the world burning outside, Arya didn't pull away. She leaned in until their foreheads touched, the scent of sandalwood and gunpowder binding them together. She had found her agency not in running, but in choosing which monster was worth fighting for. The vibration of the safe room's heavy steel door signaled the end of their isolation, but not the end of the danger. As they stepped out into the scorched remnants of the study, the air was thick with the scent of spent brass and betrayal. Dante leaned heavily on the mahogany desk, his face pale from blood loss, while his remaining loyalists stood guard near the shattered windows. The Moretti family had successfully blockaded every major artery out of the district, trapping the Salvatore survivors in a tightening noose of iron and gunpowder. The main roads are dead zones. Enzo, still playing his role for the moment, reported with a calculated grimace. If we try to push through the North Bridge, we're driving into a meat grinder. Dante looked at the tactical map, his jaw set in a line of grim frustration. It was then that Arya stepped forward, her midnight silk gown torn and stained, but her eyes burning with a clarity that silenced the room. She didn't look like a maid or a victim. She looked like a woman who had spent 3 years mastering the invisible veins of the city. "The bridge isn't the only way out," Arya said, her voice cutting through the tension. She pointed to a series of narrow, forgotten service alleys and subterranean loading docks that didn't appear on any standard GPS. "These are the routes we use when the city is paralyzed. They're too narrow for armored SUVs, but we can move the fleet through the old garment district tunnels and come out behind the Moretti line." Dante looked from the map to Arya, a flicker of renewed respect in his grey eyes. He was a man who ruled through power, but she was a woman who had survived through navigation. "Can you lead them?" he asked, the question carrying the weight of a command and a plea. "I've spent 3 years delivering packages to every shadow in this city, Dante," she replied, her hand finding the blood-stained black box that held the evidence of the true mole. "I can get you through, but you have to trust me." Against the protests of his inner circle, Dante handed her a tactical radio. Under her direction, the surviving Salvatore convoy abandoned the main roads, slipping into the dark, cramped service corridors Arya knew by heart. She navigated them through the city's labyrinthine gut, bypassing the heavy blockades with the surgical precision of a professional. As they emerged into the rain-slicked streets of the neutral zone, unscathed and undetected, Arya realized her ordinary life hadn't been a waste. It had been her training for this exact moment of empowerment. The rain washed the last of the soot and betrayal from the streets as the convoy reached the sanctuary of a secondary Salvatore stronghold. The threat of the Moretti family had been broken, silenced by the very roots they had never bothered to learn, but the silence inside the car was different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating pressure of a predator and his prey. It was the quiet of 2 people who had seen the worst of each other and survived. Dante stepped out into the damp morning air, his movement pained but steady. He turned to Arya, who stood in her ruined silk gown, the blood-stained black box still clutched in her hand like a trophy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out her phone, the glass still cracked, and a new passport with her real name, Aria Mitchell, and a stack of cash that could buy her 100 new lives far from the reach of the syndicate. "You did more than survive, Aria," Dante said, his voice a low, vulnerable vibration in the stillness. He held the items out to her, his grey eyes searching hers for the last time as a captor. "The exit is open. No guards, no enforcers, no ultimatums. You've earned your freedom 10 times over tonight. Go back to being the girl the world ignores. It's safer for you." Aria looked at the phone, a relic of a life where she was invisible, moving through the city like a ghost. She thought of the warehouse, the too pretty to bury threat, and the safe room where a monster had confessed his soul. The girl who had delivered packages was gone, burned away by the fire of the estate and the realization of her own power. She didn't reach for the phone. Instead, she stepped closer, closing the distance until she could smell the sandalwood and the fading scent of gunpowder. She placed her hand over his, pushing the passport back toward his chest. "I spent 23 years being invisible, Dante," she whispered, her voice a calm, steady force. "But when you looked at me, you didn't just see a witness or a maid, you saw a partner. I'm not going back to a life where I have to hide who I am." Dante's fingers tightened around hers, not in a command, but in a silent, desperate hope. "If you stay, there is no going back," he warned, though his thumb was already tracing the familiar pulse at her wrist. "You won't be a servant. You'll be the target at my side." "I've already been a target," Aria replied, a small, defiant smile touching her lips as she looked toward the rising sun. "Now let's show them what happens when the delivery girl finally decides to keep the secrets." Dante didn't lead her this time. They walked into the stronghold side by side, the new queen of the syndicate stepping into the light.